Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're going to take the first look at something I would consider to be a more advanced DPS strategy, specifically dual wield and two-handed weapon switching. There's really two major reasons this is done, and we'll cover both in this video. The first is that we can utilize some abilities that don't share cooldowns that are specific to either dual wield or two-handed weapons only. The second is we can exploit the way that weapon attack speeds interact with the auto attack system to get more damage from our auto attacks. Before we start though, it's worth noting that none of these tactics are worth employing if your two-handed and dual-wield weapons aren't of at least roughly the same tier and perked out appropriately. If for example you're losing the accrued damage towards Aftershock activating every time you do a weapon switch, or if you're switching down 10 tiers, the small DPS gain from these techniques is going to be completely overshadowed by the much lower ability damage when you're using that lower tier weapon set. Some small differences in tiers, such as switching from a tier 92 down to a tier 90 or a tier 90 to a tier 88, however, would be perfectly acceptable. Starting our discussion of these abilities which don't share cooldowns, we're mostly going to be focusing on basic abilities here. We've talked about these abilities in some depth before, as they usually occupy a very prominent position in your ability rotations, and they represent a very high damage basic which is available very frequently. Oddly enough though, despite their very wide-ranging similarities, these abilities don't share cooldowns in the same way that many other copies of abilities between dual-wield and two-handers do. This means we can often use the weapon switch alongside the use of this corresponding ability to supplement our ability rotations. To get an idea of what I mean, let's take a look at a dual-wield ranged rotation building from 0 to 100% without any real restrictions. Thanks to the triplet pattern that we learned about in the improvising ability rotations video, it takes quite a while for us to start having to resort to using our weaker basic abilities. Even still, we on occasion have to plug in an ability with a weaker average damage than either Needle Strike or Dazing Shot. With ranged and magic, our technique here is really just to sub out these weaker abilities with our weapon switch and corresponding ability. Even just these two relatively underwhelming switches have added an average of about 58.4% ability damage to our rotation here. This is a pretty dramatic increase for a relatively low amount of effort, especially when you consider that once we start our Death Swiftness rotation and incorporate thresholds, we'll be relying on our weak abilities less, and thus we have to do fewer switches. Now let's take a look at a different example. Let's say, for instance, that we're on a team with several other rangers, and so we're eliminating bleeds from our rotation because they're getting cancelled frequently and cutting into our DPS. Due to these limitations in our ability choices, we suddenly have weak abilities popping up all over the place. However, we can do the same thing of replacing them with the weapon switch and corresponding ability use. This replacement ability can still only be used every 3 abilities, and so we can't quite replace all of our weak abilities, but we can do most of them, and this change incorporates an extra 130.4% ability damage on average. As you can see, the more restrictions we put on the abilities that we can use, the more dramatic the effect of this weapon switching tactic is going to have on our overall DPS. This system of using the extra 5-second cooldown ability as a substitute only for weak abilities is perfect for use with ranged and magic. However, when we're talking about melee, we have something entirely different on our hands. The abilities with an unshared cooldown that we were talking about for melee have a slightly different cooldown length and can only be used every 4 abilities, so if we adopt this technique, we're entirely throwing out the pattern of rotating abilities in sets of 3 that we discussed in the improvising ability rotations video. Instead, we'll be adopting a new pattern of rotating abilities in groups of 4, for which 2 of the ability choices in any group of 4 are going to be the abilities in question, Cleave, and Decimate. If anything, this should feel easier than rotating in sets of 3, since we're still only actually having to think about filling 2 of the slots, and because of the longer duration of each individual group, abilities will come off cooldown more frequently. Cleave and Decimate are also both fundamentally stronger than the abilities we were talking about with magic and ranged, and so when we fill this ability rotation in with other strong basics like Dismember and Sever, we can find that the overall damage output from this is remarkably high even though it's only basic abilities. This of course comes at the cost of more frequent switching, but the more effort you put in, the more DPS you'll get out of it. This pattern also works remarkably well with Berserk rotations when you consider that abilities like Assault and Destroy can occupy both of those remaining 2 slots in each group of 4. Melee has an additional dimension to this in the fact that there are different thresholds available for each of these styles as well. To briefly summarize how they're best used, you'll most often be using Destroy under Berserk when you have an Adrenaline pot available, assuming you're in a single target circumstance. In contrast, when you don't have an Adrenaline pot available, it's actually better to use Hurricane as your second threshold in Berserk instead of Destroy. You may also still want to occasionally use the ability Quake for the affinity debuff, assuming that's appropriate for the situation. This brings us to the second facet of what makes dual-wield and two-hand switching so effective, and that's exploiting the auto-attack system. To have an intuitive idea of how to employ this effectively, we need to really understand how auto-attacks work, and there are quite a few misconceptions here. The most common seems to be this idea that auto-attacks charge up, which is actually completely backwards. Instead, anytime you use an auto attack or any kind of attacking ability, your auto attacks go on cooldown based on the attack speed of the weapon you used. Understanding how these cooldowns interact with the global cooldown of your other abilities used is the key to maximizing your auto attack damage. Let's start trying to get a grasp on this by looking at an actual example. If you don't already know, each game tick is 0.6 of a second, and so I've plotted out 7 ticks on screen here. Let's say for this first example that we're using Drygore Longswords, a fast attack speed weapon, and we use the ability Decimate. This activates the global cooldown, which lasts for 3 game ticks and also puts our auto attacks on that 5-tick cooldown. After Decimate, we'll use a non-attacking ability so that we don't reset the auto attack cooldown. In this case, we'll use the ability Devotion. Devotion once again puts us on that global cooldown without resetting our auto attack cooldown, and the result is we get an auto attack on that 6th tick without stalling at all between abilities. Now let's say instead we are starting with a Noxious Scythe and using Cleave. This puts our auto attacks on a longer cooldown. This means that even after the global cooldown from Freedom has expired and we're allowed to use another ability, we still need to stall an additional tick in order to get an auto attack on that 7th tick with our two-handed weapon. This stall is something that we discussed doing in the basic DPS videos, and is certainly worthwhile because two-hander auto attacks are about 50% stronger than the normal main hand auto attacks. The tricky thing that we can do here is if we go back to our original example where we're starting out with dual wield equipped and using Decimate, we can switch to our two-handed weapon just after using that ability, and this has no impact on the auto attack cooldown timer. So the result is we get a two-hander auto attack, which is about 50% stronger than the normal main hand auto attack, but without the 1-tick extra stall. This technical breakdown is probably a little bit confusing, but the simple takeaway here is that we're using an ability with our dual-wield weapon and then switching to a two-handed weapon before we're using any of the abilities on the right. As crazy as it might sound, this technique makes these normally non-damaging abilities hit roughly equivalent to a 128% damage ability. This already makes them stronger than about half of your basic abilities, but they make an interesting contribution to your ability rotation as well, as you get an extra 3% adrenaline from the auto attack on top of the 8% that you gain from using the ability in the first place. There's even one interesting special case we can do with the ability Freedom. The timing on this switch is much more precise, but if we switch to our two-handed weapon immediately after using the Freedom ability, we not only get our two-handed auto attack, but we also get an offhand auto attack from the dual-wield weapons that we were using. I'll go ahead and be honest and say from a technical perspective, I have absolutely no clue why this works, nor has anyone else that I've asked about it. However, it's definitely worth working into your rotation, as this effectively makes Freedom an ability which deals 158% ability damage as well as grants 12% adrenaline. You may now be asking why we haven't talked much about auto-attacking with magic, and the reason for that is that manually casting the spell from the bar can already force an auto-attack a tick early. We already discussed this briefly in the Magic DPS Basics video, and it means we don't need to do any kind of weapon switching in order to force a two-hander auto without stalling. We can, however, combine the techniques of switching weapons to reduce our auto attack cooldown timer as well as forcing them a tick early by manually casting through the bar to create a new strategy that's colloquially called 4-tick auto attacking. These kinds of rotations, however, are complicated enough that they deserve a dedicated video, so that's what we'll be covering next. Now finally, before we close out this video, I'm going to preempt a few questions and talk about the 2 primary reasons why you may not be getting an auto attack when you're implementing these strategies. The first is trying to do one of these switches after a channeled ability. Like we discussed in the basic DPS videos, each hit from these channeled abilities resets the auto attack timer, and so none of these combos work if you preface them with a channeled ability. The second possible problem is that you're switching your weapon by clicking it from the inventory instead of using an action bar. For whatever reason, doing a weapon switch directly from the inventory breaks combat, and so the game effectively thinks you're no longer attacking your enemy until your next ability is used on them. This will cause you to fail to get any of the auto attacks and thus render all of these techniques useless. For this reason, I highly recommend you set up an auxiliary bar just for your gear switches. You can use keybinds for them or just click them directly from the bar, and in either case it will work for these techniques. Thank you guys as always for watching. There's a lot of information in this video, and a lot of the techniques are difficult in terms of precision timing, so if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comment section down below. I'll do what I can to clear those up for you, but I think a lot of you will be able to get it just with a bit of practice. As usual, a big thanks to Wumpery for his generous support on Patreon, and I'll see all of you guys in the next video.